like to welcome everyone in this lecture series. Today is the seventh lecture of our lecture series, and uh, before this lecture, uh, we had another lecture by Professor Chidananda Bhattacharya, and now we have another lecture by Professor Arka Chattopadhyay, who will be delivering his lecture on Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Before that, I would like to uh, hear something about some words from uh, Arka Chattopadhyay. Arka Chattopadhyay is an assistant professor of literary studies and philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. He is MA MPhil in English Literature from Presidency College, Jadavpur University. He has written his MPhil thesis on Samuel Beckett and Alabadu and finished his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. He has published in books like Deleuze and Beckett, Notes, Post-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Literature and Film, Gerald Bernstein, another work in this one, etc. Moreover, he had published in different journals as Textual Practice, Interventions, Samuel Beckett Today, um, Culture and Society, Sound Studies, and the Harold Pinter Review. He has co-edited the book Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature and has guest edited the SBTA issue on Samuel Beckett and the extensions of the mind. Professor Chattopadhyay is the founding editor of the online literary journal Songlap and a contributing editor to Harold Pinter Review. His first monograph, Beckett, Laka, and the Mathematical Writing of the Real has been published by Bloomsbury Academic, UK in 2019. He has recently co-edited a volume on Nobarun Bhattacharya for Bloomsbury, India in 2020 and is working on a monograph on posthumanism uh, by Orient Black Swan and two edited volumes on affective ecologies and Badu and modernism. I, on behalf of Lalgड़ College and English Department of Lalgड़ College, uh, would request Professor Chattopadhyay to start his lecture on Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Before that, I would take 1 minute. I would like to, I would request our respected OIC sir to say something about this lecture series. He is with us, sir.
Well, is my voice reaching to everybody?
Yes, sir,
Yes,
you
sir.
are
Yes,
perfectly
yes.
audible.
So thank you very much. We meet once again today for the second lecture in this lecture series organized by the Department of English, Government General Degree College, Lalgड़. This is the second phase of our lecture series. First phase has been particularly addressed to the texts that have been there in the syllabus of the sixth semester. Now we have taken up some texts which are there in the syllabus of the second and fourth semester, and Waiting for Godot, on which Professor Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay, Assistant Professor IIT Gandhinagar, uh, belonging to Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, will be speaking, is a wonderful text, is a challenging text, and I think it is an open-ended one as well, because there are so many things to be interpreted from the text, and still this drama fascinates us. So this lecture series has been modeled, organized, and conducted with a view to broaden the scope of these students so that they could learn to read the text, not only for their examination related purpose, but also for further development and further introspective studies, which will enable them to gather not only a thorough knowledge of the particular text, but also the socio-cultural scenario that were there, which is responsible for the production of the text, as well as the dramaturgy and other things. Because modern drama is a vast and complex area. So this is our own motto, so that we could give our students a kind of avenue upon which they could exploit later on after finishing their classroom studies. So I welcome, I greet everybody, good afternoon, and I welcome Dr. Arka Chattopadhyay, and I welcome you all who have made it to be participated in this lecture, in this particular talk. I hope you will be, not only you will be enjoying, but also you will be having a new kind of illumination from Dr. Chattopadhyay's talk. I welcome you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, virtually though, but I would like to welcome you physically as well. So with these few words, I request the requirement to introduce Dr. Chattopadhyay so that the lecture will begin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words. Now we shall be heading towards the main lecture. I request Professor Arka Chattopadhyay to start the lecture. Arka, what do you mean?
Sure. Am I audible clearly?
Yes.
And the volume is fine, right?
Yes.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Thank you so much to the Department of English, Lalgore College, to Dolpayon, to Professor Borua, Professor Chakraborty. Thank you everyone for inviting me to do this talk. It's always a pleasure to talk about Beckett and perhaps his most seminal and his most famous play, Waiting for Godot, the one that we will be talking about here. So I'm not going to speak for more than an hour. That's the plan. Maybe even less than that, and it will be good to have a conversation at the end. So if you have a problem with anything, if there is a lack of clarity on any of the points we discuss, please get back to me at the end of the talk so that we can discuss it and maybe have a more collective conversation about Waiting for Godot. Of course, I mean, no one can do justice to any text in one single 1 hour talk. It goes without saying. One would need at least 5 or 6 lectures to do some sort of a partial justice to a text which is as complex and as experimental in certain ways as Waiting for Godot. So I will be trying to touch upon multiple threads throughout this talk as much as possible. Let us begin with the context behind the very composition of Waiting for Godot. As some of you may know, Beckett was a bilingual writer. And at this point, when he started writing the play Waiting for Godot around 1948-49, he had already sort of moved over to Paris. So he was born in Foxrock in the vicinity of Dublin in Ireland. And like many of the Irishmen, and perhaps his literary master in a certain sense, James Joyce, like James Joyce and also John Middleton Synge to a certain extent, he moved out of Ireland and moved into France, where Joyce was at that point. So Beckett was quite actively writing from the 30s. Let's keep that in mind. He was born in 1906, and he started writing quite actively, first in English and then moved over to French language. And almost his entire oeuvre is doubly written across 2 languages. Sometimes even 3. There's a little bit of German. There are some texts that he quite strongly translated into German, even though it was with the help of a German translator, he did most of the work in terms of translation. So again, Waiting for Godot was written first in French as En attendant Godot, and then it was translated by Beckett himself into English. 1953 is the first sort of major production, in fact the premiere of Waiting for Godot, in Teatro du Babylon in Paris, and it was directed by a very famous theater director, especially a very famous, let's say, experimental theater director, someone of the caliber of Roger Blin, Rogerblin, Roger Blin. And subsequently, it was directed by some of the finest directors across continents. In fact, Peter Hall directed it in the US. So did Alan Schneider. Later on, there were many other famous directors who took it up. Again, I mean, one could do an entire discussion, I suppose, of the very production histories of Waiting for Godot. But I wanted to draw attention to this bilingual structure of the text and the fact that it was written first in French and then translated into English. And as you can understand, with almost any act of self-translation, there's almost a new creation, as it were, through the act of self-translation. So Beckett practically rewrote his entire corpus, twice, as it were, across two languages. And it's also interesting why he started to write in French. In fact, he said that he wanted to write without style. This is the statement he made. He wanted to write without style. There was too much stylistic, let's say, preoccupation in especially the Hiberno English, what is called the Irish English. And he wanted to sort of move away from that and write in a language that did not come to him very easily. Of course, it was not his mother tongue. It was not a language that came to him very easily. He had to sort of acculturate himself in that language. He had to slowly develop the skills in that language. What is often said is the fact that perhaps the colossal shadow of James Joyce was another reason not to write only in English, because Beckett saw himself as being too caught up in the language of the master until he could, make a very clear cut, as he would say later on, that Joyce was primarily a synthesizer. So this is again Beckett's words I'm using. Joyce is a synthesizer while I'm an analyzer. Joyce expands, I contract. And again, it's a compositional technique that we see in Beckett. In most of his texts, we see that they start with a lot of detail, and then he slowly sort of chips away at them and takes those details out to the point that we are left with a very general set of information, let's say. Something like, the famous country road, evening, a tree in Waiting for Godot. We don't know where the play is located. We don't know whether we are talking about an Irish landscape or a French landscape. We are not very sure. And that's part of the whole deliberate gesture. And this is something that we see throughout his body of work, not just in Waiting for Godot. We see this in Endgame. We see this across the shorter plays like Kraft's Last Tape that are set indoor, but also plays like Happy Days that are set outdoor. Again, in all, unnameable locations, unlocatable places, right till the very end with, plays like What, Where, or What at the very fag end of his career when he was writing, not only for the stage, also for radio, television, and cinema as well. He wrote a film script, which was eventually turned into a film by Alan Schneider, and it was one of the last appearances in that film. We had one of the last appearances of the great Buster Keaton, the silent movie comedy actor, a contemporary of Charlie Chaplin. Again, Beckett had a very strong interest in cinema, wanted to work with Chaplin, wrote to Chaplin. Historically, that letter never reached Chaplin because of the war and the messed up communication system. Beckett actually initially wanted to have Chaplin in that role in the film called Film. The film is called Film. So I'm trying to give you a general sense of his career. So from these early plays, Beckett would soon sort of shift towards really small plays that are performed in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes even 1 minute, a play like Breath. And he would call these plays dramaticus. So again, I guess we could understand the aesthetics of contraction. As he was saying, Joyce is a synthesizer, I'm an analyzer, he expands, I contract. So this contraction or this minimalism was absolutely central to his aesthetics and it stayed there, all his life in a way. He wrote plays that were literally at the edge of what could be done in the theatre. And Waiting for Godot, in certain ways, is perhaps one of his most orthodox plays. You'd be surprised to know this, perhaps, some of you, but it is one of his most orthodox plays, one of his most stageable plays. Some of the later works, especially a work like What or What Where, as I mentioned, Not I, these are extremely complicated works to stage in terms of the very, the structure of the play, or even a play like Footfalls and so on. I mean, if we had had the time, we could have gone in more depth about each of these plays. We don't have the time, but I want to set up some sort of a theatrical context under which Beckett works, and also a sort of a historical context, again, to think of the study of Waiting for Godot. So to talk about the theatrical context, of course, in the 50s, when Beckett was writing this play, when it was staged, there was a clear division between the Broadway tradition, the traditional realistic theatre, and the avant-garde theatre, what was called avant-garde theatre or experimental theatre, or sometimes, to use the more American usage, off-Broadway theatre. So anyway, Beckett was part of, let's say, a very diverse tradition of anti-realisms. There is no one anti-realism. And again, let's get this right. Of course, anti-realism could resituate realism. Anti-realism could come back to realism, redefine realism, but it is anti in the sense that it wants to at least attack the traditional orthodox sense of realism in the theatre. As Govipayan and some of the professors were saying in the beginning, it's a play that defies a lot of typical traditional theatrical logic. There is not much of an action, there is a lot of repetition, and as it was very famously said about this play by Vivienne Mercier, one of Beckett's earliest friends and a theatre critic, that Beckett made the impossible happen by having nothing happen twice. Twice because it's a two-acter. It's a two-act play, as you know. We'll come more specifically to specific aspects of the play, but again, I'm just still in the process of setting it up in a certain theatrical tradition of anti-realism. So in this tradition of anti-realism, we have a whole series of writers who are already very strongly at work, especially in the French tradition. We have someone like Antonin Artaud, A-R-T-A-U-D. Artaud's idea of the theatre of cruelty is one of the central ideas of anti-realistic theatre at this point. Later on, we would have someone like Grotowski, the theatre of the rounds, and various ideas of poor theatre that come from Grotowski. So just as we have a certain tradition of realism, which is primarily, let's take a few names to help you situate it. Bernard Shaw is a famous realistic playwright. So is someone like Ibsen. So Ibsen, Shaw, we have a very strong realistic tradition in the theatre here. What is this idea of realism? That the theatrical spectacle is going to mimetically reproduce the social world, the larger real world outside. Okay, and it will be a representational theatre. So this idea of realism is based on a certain kind of representational relation between the theatrical text and the world outside it. Now, as opposed to that, we have theatre workers like Bertolt Brecht, for example. Bertolt Brecht was, again, a very important figure, someone Beckett knew very well, not in person, but as a playwright. And again, Brecht's idea of the alienation effect was one very important anti-realistic technique in the theatre. So this idea of the alienation effect, as many of you would know, is primarily, again, attacking this realistic representation of the world on the stage. So the idea is, in various ways, theatre will expose its own dynamics. Theatre will alienate the audience from this representational idea of whatever is happening on the stage being a representation of, the world outside. So when theatre rejects this idea of a kind of a mirrorical representation, that's one of the ways of thinking about the alienation effect. Now, there was that. There was also, as I said, Arto's idea of theatre of cruelty, which is a very physiological theatre. Arto famously said that if we have to go to the metaphysics, we have to go through the skin, and we have to puncture the skin in order to go deeper into metaphysical questions in the theatre. So theatre of cruelty was again a non-realistic, anti-realistic way of staging plays. Again, this is a particular technique of staging we are talking about. Realism is not simply a phenomenon within the theatrical text. It's also a matter of staging it. Of course, even Ibsen and Bernard Shaw can be and have been staged in a very anti-realistic manner. So things are not black and white. Let's get that straight. So Beckett was part of this, let's say broadly speaking, anti-realistic tradition, where he wanted to go against this realistic diktat of theatre, and hence, lack of detailing, unlocatability of the setting, the minimalism of the setting. Again, if you think of Waiting for Godot, it's very minimalistic, the setting. The time is evening, we have a tree, and we have two people essentially waiting for someone who never comes. And then we have a sort of a master and slave coming in together, a chance encounter with these two. Didi and Gogo are the two waiting for Godot, Vladimir and Estragon, the two tramps. And again, very Chaplin-esque figures, Chaplin-esque tramps. And we have then Lucky and Pozzo, who are, the master and the slave, so to speak. It's important to note here, it's an important historical fact, that at the close of his life, Brecht was trying to do a version of Waiting for Godot. He died before he could complete the re-scripting. So he was writing his own director's script of the Waiting for Godot. He was doing a reworking, essentially. And he was very interested, of course, being a leftist and so on, he was very interested in that sort of master-slave dynamic of Lucky and Pozzo. And that was, in fact, one of the most important threads for Brecht when it came to Beckett's play. So just a little bit, this is about the theatrical context. Now to go into the social, political and historical context behind the play. So Beckett, as I said, was already a reasonably well-known writer, I would say. He had left Ireland for various reasons. He was quite critical of the kind of cultural nationalism that was imposed on Ireland, and he was critical of W.B. Yeats as well, at least his politics to a large extent, though he was quite fond of Yeats's poetry. As we would know, later on he would do a play like But the Clouds, which is essentially inspired by one of the famous poems from Yeats's The Tower. So it's a complex relationship, again, let me not simplify it, but like Joyce, Beckett was also quite critical of the nationalist strain in Ireland, and in a way he wanted to move away from things like the National Theatre Project and the way Ireland was shaping itself up, as it were. And he was also severely disgruntled with the censorship practices. We all know how Joyce was censored in Ireland. Beckett's first collection of short stories, More Tricks Than Kicks, was shunned in Ireland or censored because of the title, in fact. Nobody cared to read the book. It was censored because of the title. So anyway, this early Swiftian reaction in Beckett, we have a text called Censorship in the Sarostat, which is a biting satire on Irish censorship laws back in the 30s. So he was starting to write from the 30s. He had written his first novel in English, Murphy, and he had subsequently written other texts as well, like Mercier and Camille, which is an important text for Waiting for Godot. We'll come back to this later. He had written the first couple of books of the famous trilogy of novels, Molloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnamable. So Waiting for Godot was written in between Malone Dies and The Unnamable, between these two novels. And as he said, this was a fairly relaxing work for him, because he was writing some really dark prose at the time, and this was a bit of a diversion, a bit of a relaxation for Beckett. This is something that he said on record about Waiting for Godot and the context in which he wrote it. Now, there's another interesting context we have to keep in mind here. This is the war the post-war years, and Beckett served for French resistance. So he took a certain stance against the Gestapo's beheading of the Jews, the killing of the Jews, the massacres, and so on. And he was a part of the French resistance. Again, it would be a misunderstanding to very quickly, see him as a French nationalist as opposed to an Irish nationalist. He wasn't a French nationalist either. In fact, for his entire life, he held on to the Irish identity in spite of various requests and attempts being made. He did not want to be square bracketed with a sort of French citizenship, so to speak. In fact, at one point, when he was asked whether he was French, he very famously replied, au contraire, which means, on the contrary, I'm not French, I'm not English either. In fact, he was asked both questions and he said, au contraire. Anyway, he comes from a Protestant tradition, which again has to be noted, because again, we have a predominantly Catholic Ireland back in the day when Beckett was in Ireland. And again, he faced a certain degree of othering, being a Protestant in Ireland. Again, I'm sure most of you would know about the troubles and the sort of long-drawn history of conflict between Irish Catholics and Protestants, and the sort of, the politics of nationalism there, again, when it comes to the two communities. Nevertheless, we'll go back to that perhaps if you have questions later on. But Beckett was actively part of the resistance work in the wake of the war. This is an important point to keep in mind. He was part of the cell called Gloria, and he was literally hounded by the Gestapos, right? He was fleeing away. Beckett and the then girlfriend Suzanne, whom he married later, they were both being hounded by the Gestapos. Some of his friends were killed for being Jewish, and he, as I say, took a stand there. So this historical context of the war is something to keep in mind, because it casts a very significant shadow on the play. Even though it's not directly a play about the war, it does not depict the war or show the war, but just as Endgame, the play he wrote after this, was a play about the atom bomb without depicting the atom bomb. Similarly, again, this is a play about the war without showing us the war. But the context of the war needs to be kept in mind when we read the play. So just a little bit, I think that's I'll stop there in terms of the historical and the socio-political context behind the play. Now, to come to the play itself, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm aware of it. So I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the material that has surfaced in recent times. There's this huge project called Beckett Digital Manuscript Project, and as a result of that, as you can understand, they're digitizing all the manuscripts because most of these texts have multiple versions across different languages, corrected, and as you know, with theater, the theater text is always wobbly. It's unstable because it partially depends on the performances. And Beckett would not want to publish his theater texts before they were performed at least once. So there's a lot of instability around, right? Anyway, so all these texts, the novels, the plays, everything he wrote is being digitized, is being archived, primarily by University of Reading, but also across continents as well. And this is the edition, the genetic edition of Waiting for Godot, which has recently come out from Bloomsbury. And I'll talk a little bit through this, but the reason I think we need to go to things like this, we also need to ideally consult texts like this. This is the theatrical notebook of Waiting for Godot. And now all Beckett's notebooks have come out in paperback as well, which makes it a little more affordable, still quite ostentatiously priced, but relatively more affordable for libraries possibly. Now, the theatrical notebooks are, of course, primarily the notebooks Beckett kept as a director of his own plays. So with time, when he started directing theater, when he started directing his own plays, there were all these places, especially in the Schiller Theater in Berlin, where there was a major Beckett festival in the 1970s, 1975, and Beckett directed his plays, Waiting for Godot, Endgame, and so on. So these are theatrical notebooks from those performances. and it tells us about the precision he had in mind. I'll just give you one example. There could be so many. As I said, this notebook itself demands a couple of lectures. But as you can see here, if you see closely, this is the level of detailing that we see in a sort of Beckett notebook. These sketches that you saw show the exact blocking of the characters. So he was extremely detailed and quite obsessional when it came to the exact delivery of a line. So he had particular spaces in mind, particular spots in mind on the stage where a line will have to be delivered. It can only be delivered on that spot, as it were. So it was very mathematical, as you could see in the staging directions as well. So the theatrical notebooks, of course, make us aware of this, this degree of precision and how Beckett divided the play. What were the different units in which he divided the play? For example, Waiting for Godot, and it tells us many more things. Nevertheless, to come back to some of the authorial contexts now, before we quickly go through certain aspects of the play. Again, in Waiting for Godot, I mean, though it is loosely put, it's his first play, but it was not his first play. He had written plays before this. There are three cases to keep in mind. One is, of course, a play called Eleutheria. In Greek, the word means freedom. Eleutheria was a play he wrote with a character called Victor Crap, maybe a sort of prelude to Crap's Last Take, and the more famous character there, Crap. Eleutheria was never published in his lifetime because he was not happy with the play. It was not even kind of staged in his lifetime. So it was staged and published after his death. Nevertheless, there's Eleutheria, a more complicated play in the sense that it has many, many more characters, a split stage, and so on. Won't go into the details there. He also wrote a play called Human Wishes about the later life of Dr. Samuel Johnson. He was extremely interested in Johnson's relationship with his wife and how Johnson's own health kind of, gave away, as it were, after Thrale's disappearance, his wife's disappearance. So Human Wishes was another fragment of a play. Then there's a play in German called The Medieval Triangle, which he wrote, again, just a few pages, did not go beyond that. Then there's a text which does not exist of a play called The Kid, again, following Chaplin's The Kid, Chaplin's famous film. This was a play he did in Trinity College, Dublin, while he was a student there. So there were attempts at theatre, let's put it like that. But Waiting for Godot was the most successful one, the first successful one. And it, in fact, was a major turning point for his entire career, not just for his reputation as a writer, but his reputation as a playwright, because he was not just a playwright. As I've been saying, he was a poet, he was a short story writer, a novelist, and very accomplished in each of those areas. So yeah, that's just a little bit I wanted to say about some of the authorial contexts. Now, to sort of quickly make a dive into the play, it's actually a very simple play at one level, and in fact, you'd be surprised to know it's a high school text. In fact, it's a secondary school text in France. It is taught in the secondary school. Because there's an element of childishness about the play. The characters are quite childlike. Didi and Gogo, the names would say so. Vladimir and Estragon, they're like two little kids, as it were. They talk like kids. They have a childlike way of speaking and dealing with one another. Now, I named this particular novel Mercier and Camier. Mercier and Camier. This is the name of two characters. This is a novel Beckett wrote much before Waiting for Godot, but we have all these couples in Beckett, male couples that have been sometimes read along homoerotic lines. Beckett himself used the expression pseudo-couple, P-S-E-U-D-O, pseudo-couple for Mercier and Camier. And subsequently, it has been used for these pairings we have in Waiting for Godot. It's not just Estragon and Vladimir, it's also Lucky and Pozzo. It's also the two branches of the tree and the two leaves on the tree. In fact, it's important, Beckett initially had three in mind. but then he changed it. He changed the number of branches in the tree to 2 from 3, and the number of leaves that appear on the tree in the second act, again from 3 to 2, to make it another couple. So just like Didi and Gogo are a couple, Lucky and Kodzo are a couple, the 2 leaves are a couple, the 2 branches are a couple. This famous tree was designed by, in some of the French productions, by none other than the great French sculptor and artist, Alberto Giacometti, who was Beckett's great friend as well, and a great artist, a famous artist on his own terms. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that almost like an anecdote. But let's come back to the title. In the English title, we have this subtitle which says Tragicomedy in 2 acts. Interestingly, the French version of the text does not call itself a tragicomedy. Right? This is an expression Beckett seems to use only for the English text, which is not to say that the French text is not tragicomedy. In fact, in his own direction, Beckett was always very, careful about maintaining this balance between tragedy and comedy. And there's a famous line in a letter where he says, how do you, so the question is, how does one differentiate between tragedy and comedy? And Beckett has a typical witty answer where he says, okay, we have Democritus laughing and Heraclitus weeping. They're looking at each other. Now, pick your fancy. Is it a tragedy or a comedy? So the question is Democritus's laughter making Heraclitus weep? Or is it Heraclitus's weeping that makes Democritus laugh? Again, what he's trying to say is it is indeterminable. It is impossible to determine whether it's a tragedy or a comedy. And he's using the example of 2 great Greek philosophers. Democritus, as you know, was the philosopher of laughter, and Heraclitus, the famous philosopher who said you cannot take bath in the same river twice. He is the philosopher of weeping, the philosopher of sadness. So again, there's a sort of a pseudo couple between tragedy and comedy as well, just as there's a pseudo coupling of all these characters. Right? In fact, in another place, Beckett also plays on these names and calls the philosopher Heraclitus and Democritus, just to sort of swapping the syllables of their names. Anyway, so I did want to draw upon this particular idea of the tragicomedy, how the tragedy and the comedy become indeterminate. They do not simply mingle, but they become one to the point that you cannot distinguish between tragedy and comedy. And this is a particular position Beckett had all his life. The famous sentence from Endgame would be a testimony. The sentence is, there's nothing funnier than unhappiness. There's nothing funnier than unhappiness. The play is famous for this act of waiting, which in a way kills the traditional idea of action. And it's been a discussion for a long time in the interpretations of the play. Is waiting an action or is it a condition? When we say waiting, is it an action or a condition? Even if you think of the word grammatically, it's complicated, right? Because waiting is, grammatically speaking, a gerund. So it could be used as a verb, I'm waiting for Godot, or it could be used as a noun as well. This play is about waiting. Here, waiting is a noun. So just as a gerund is both a noun and a verb, waiting is both a condition and an action. And this play, in fact, has often been compared to another famous play in the European experimental theatre, Louis Pirandello's 6 Characters in Search of an Author. Jean Anouilh, another famous French dramatist, he compared the premiere of Waiting for Godot in 1953 with this premiere of 6 Characters in Search of the Author almost 3 decades back, and said it's as significant as that. Nevertheless, the idea that connects these 2 plays is a certain notion of meta-theatre. That, we're talking about theatre about theatre. There's a lot of references to theatre in Waiting for Godot, to music halls, to various kinds of dance performances, and so on and so forth. So anyway, to come back to the point I was making about waiting, the play in certain ways is more about waiting than about Godot. Of course, the typical symbolic trap, the interpretive trap that Beckett sets up in the play is to call this absentee character Godot. The moment you call anyone Godot, in English at least, it would unmistakably have that ring of God. So does it mean Godot is God? And this is the way the Irish would pronounce it. It's not Godot, it's Godot. Okay? It's the syllable is, the accent falls on the first syllable. Whereas in certain British and French pronunciations, it would be Godot, Godot. The second syllable would be accented. Nevertheless, so who is Godot? That's the second part of the title, waiting for Godot. I think this question, to a certain extent, is rendered irrelevant by the play. Of course, the traditional way in which this play has been interpreted is in the sort of Martinez-Lenian way of theatre of the absurd, this play being inspired by existentialism, talking about the meaninglessness of life. Godot is a representative of the meaning of life, the metaphysical meaning of life, which never comes. In that sense, he's the absent God, as it were. But this is a symbolist interpretation of a play which resists this very symbolism. So I would like to underline this irony. As Beckett himself said, in order to be interested in the structure of an idea, you don't necessarily need to believe in it. There are various religious references in this play. But is it a religious play? The answer is no, it's not a religious play. Is it a Christian play? No, it's not a Christian play. But that does not mean it does not use Christianity. So again, just as Beckett said, he uses Christianity like a mythology. Christianity offers a set of stories for Beckett, and sometimes he's fascinated by those stories. So Christianity is like a treasure trove of stories, like a mythology. But he's not someone who's necessarily writing theological plays or religious plays. These are not plays which sacralize religion. In fact, a play like Waiting for Godot shows a failure, to put it in a sort of postmodern way, it shows the failure of all these meta-narratives, all these grand narratives. The grand narrative of Christianity, the grand narrative of, resistance, revolution, etc., the grand narrative of the war as well. So this is a play where we are looking at a world which is bleak because all these grand narratives have failed, have been tarnished, as it were, by the sordid realities of the war. So it's not a religious play. And I wouldn't go into this discussion too further, to talk about who is God. Nobody knows, and that's the point. It's more important to see this as a principle of absence. Just as in that famous story by Edgar Allan Poe, Purloined Letter, we don't know the contents of the letter. Similarly, we will never know who Godot is, and that's the whole point. What is interesting is that when you make the word is a coinage, right? And again, the word in English has that association with God, but the play was written first in French, and the name wasn't Dieu, which is the word for God in French, but the name was still Godot, on account of Godot, right? So it's not that Beckett had that idea, or wanted to sort of push that idea too much, but it's a part of this play's strategy, and a lot of other Beckett plays, or a lot of Beckett works as well, that there is an attempt by the writer to seduce the reader with certain kinds of interpretation. Like, as I said, the hermeneutic trap or the interpretive trap here for the reader is to identify Godot with God. Beckett, the writer, in his cunning, he wants that. He wants the reader or the audience to do that to a certain extent, which is what shows that Godot cannot be identified with God. But what is interesting is that when he adds that second syllable to God and makes it Godot, God is a single syllable, right? Godot makes it two syllables. there is that second O that gets added, G-O-D-O-T, right? So that second O, in a way, mimics the first O. There are two holes there, two zeros or two O's, just as there are two acts to this play, right? So again, we have this structure of, what could be called differential repetition. There's a structure of differential repetition in this play, Waiting for Godot, to the suggestion that we can have a third act, which goes back to the first act again, a fourth act, which goes back to the second act again. So there's a sort of recursive structure. It's like a circular infinity, where the same things get repeated again and again. So they're caught in a time loop, as it were. It's a sort of very surrealist idea, that a time loop. And Beckett did have his historical associations with surrealism. He was very much part of the surrealist circle to a large extent. I mean, he was friends with Adamov. He was very much a part of the Transition Circle, which is again a sort of post-surrealist magazine. And George Duthuy and others, he was friends with all of them. Bataille as well. Many writers who had a sort of, who were not completely surrealists, but had a surrealist lineage, let's say. Right? So, but let's come back to the play now. Now, some of the themes, apart from waiting and the figure of Godot, as I said, more than asking who is Godot, we should look at the significance of this structural principle of absence, absenting out the major character. Again, how to write a play about the atom bomb without having the atom bomb figure directly in the play? How to write a play about the war without showing the war? Those are the kind of questions we have to think about. Again, in a late play like Come and Go, not a late play, in a mid-career play like Come and Go, which Beckett called dramaticule. That's the first time we use the word dramaticule. In Come and Go, we have these words whispered by three women among themselves. We never hear what these words are, but that's the most crucial secret in the play, as it were. So Beckett often does this, the structural principle of absence. A quick word about the theatre of the absurd appellation. There's a lot of problem with that appellation. It should not be taken on face value because there was no theatrical movement called absurdism. This is a critical term coined by a famous theatre critic of the times, Martin Esslin, who wrote that famous book, Theatre of the Absurd. Even now, it seems to be the predominant way in which Beckett is taught, especially in India. But the expression or the idea has completely lost its mojo, so to speak, in the research field in Samuel Beckett studies. In fact, nobody would use terms like absurdism now when they talk about Beckett and many of these other writers, in fact, writers like Pinter as well. Nevertheless, just a quick word on this. Again, it's a slightly simplistic term, absurd, theatre of the absurd, to call all these very diverse playwrights like Ionesco, Beckett, Pinter, to call them absurdists, again, is a bit of a straitjacketing. Because there is no value judgment. Again, the problem with the theatre of the absurd as a terminology is that it overplays the tragic and underplays the comic, which is the problem. If you have read the play, you would know in the very first half of the first act, we have this exchange about a story that is there in St. Augustine. Beckett picked it up from St. Augustine. It's about two thieves, and one of the thieves was damned, the other thief was saved. This story comes back in The Unnameable as well, the novel Beckett writes after finishing Waiting for Godot. Again, the story is important because this is the impeccable balance between hope and despair. So, Didi and Gogo say, one of the thieves was damned, do not hope. One of the thieves was saved, do not despair. So one has to maintain that precarious and yet the impeccable balance between despair and hope, and hence between tragedy and comedy. If we, tilt it in one direction too much, what we have is something like a theatre of the absurd, which is all about this, tragic meaninglessness of life. But that's not what works as a value judgment in playwrights like Beckett. So that's a very quick word on the theatre of the absurd. Let us move on, and let me just talk a little bit about some of the aspects of this play in the next 15 minutes or so that I have. So very briefly, I want you to pay attention to the friendship and care aspect of the play. How both characters, Vladimir and Estragon, they share a very interesting chemistry. It's like a husband-wife chemistry. In fact, Beckett once jokingly said, they are like me and Suzanne, like him and his wife. It's a bickering chemistry. There's a lot of bickering going on, a lot of complaining going on. But at the same time, they're like old friends. There's a little bit of an obhiman, so to speak. That word cannot be translated into English, I feel. But there's also a very strong sense of attachment to each other. It's, in fact, very early on, the play says it's too much for one man. So we need at least two people to get through this. And hence we have Vladimir and Estragon. We have this very provocative opening sentence, nothing to be done, which has often been read as a little nod at Lenin's famous text and its title, What is to be done? Nothing to be done, as it were, responds to that question of Lenin's. And the reason this allusion has often been thought about is that Vladimir, of course, Vladimir Ilyich was the name of Lenin. I mean, that was Lenin's name. And Vladimir is the character who says it in Waiting for Godot, nothing to be done. I'm beginning to come around to that opinion and so on and so forth. So there is an element of despair in that sentence, of course, nothing to be done. Nothing is left for us to do. But again, to go back to that meta-theatrical aspect, it's like two characters who are left without a script and they've been asked to perform. How would they perform? What would they do? How would they pass the time? So that's the meta-theatrical angle in a play like Waiting for Godot. And again, a Bengali playwright like Nobhindu Sen, I've recently written a book chapter on this. A Bengali playwright like Nobhindu Sen wrote a play called Noyon Kobirer Pala, which was quite patently inspired or influenced by Waiting for Godot, where we have two actors who are missing a script and they have to perform. How would they perform without a script? That's the classic problematic in Pirandello's play as well. So let's keep that sort of point in mind. Now, a word about the setting of the play. Undefined, not located. Many critics have said, of course, because of the similarity of the setting with an Irish landscape, many have said it's located in the Irish heartlands, in the rural Ireland, with all the bogs and so on. That's the kind of landscape we seem to be looking at. But it's important that we have a plant, the tree which seems to be deserted, completely leafless in the first act, and then a leaf grows, two leaves grow in the second act. So we have the tree, a plant, we have these animal metaphors to talk about lucky, I'll come to that later, but we also have a stone. The English text says a low mound, but there's essentially a stone that Beckett wanted to have in each production that he directed. And this is a stone on which Vladimir and Estragon sit. Sometimes they fall asleep there, or they try to put their boots on, sitting on that stone. So we have a mineral, aspect, and the expression abode of stones is very important in the play. It comes back in that famous long speech of Lucky's monologue, right? We'll perhaps make a quick comment on that later. But the expression abode of stones is important because we are talking about a world which is slowly turning into stones, almost becoming petrified. There's a sort of an ecological discourse here of dead nature. Again, I'm reminded of this famous exchange in Endgame where, between, again, another pseudo couple, Ham and Clove, we have this exchange where one says, nature has forgotten us. And then Ham says, there's no more nature. And then Clove says, no more nature, you exaggerate. So this idea of ecology without nature, an idea that was in a way coined by Timothy Morton, environmental philosopher. Going into a bit of a digression here, but let me come back. So there's an ecological concern in a play like Waiting for Godot. The world we are talking about is slowly turning into, stones, as it were. And again, there's an echo of a much later prose text, one of his most beautiful prose texts, perhaps, Il Seen, Il Saved, a late prose text by Beckett, where again we have the same idea of a world turning into stones. Nevertheless, so we have the stone, we have the plant, we have humans, we have animals. That's the repertoire, the entire life world of a play like Waiting for Godot. And we have the play that begins in an evening, goes on in the dusk, in the twilight, then there's moonlight at the end, and again the next day, similarly, it starts again in the evening and disappears into the night. So the play is, in terms of its time, located in this transitional zone between day and night, between light and darkness, and it's sort of gradually fading into the dark, as it were. There's this idea that the purest act of waiting happens when you wait knowing that the person you're waiting for is not going to come. When you wait in spite of knowing that the person you're waiting for is never going to arrive, that is the purest act of waiting. Beckett's friend and the great French philosopher Maurice Blanchon, he wrote a text on waiting where he argued something like this, and the text was quite strongly inspired by Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. This act of waiting has been theorized in different ways. For example, some critics have seen in this act of waiting a kind of a pacifism and a critique of this notion of war as aggressive action. So in early 50s, in the post-war period, when Beckett writes this play, one could see the passivity as a kind of pacifism, right? The fact that they're waiting and they're not jumping into an action to do something. Anyway, to come back to the point I was discussing about waiting and Godot as the structural absence. By the way, another text that I would recommend you to read, if possible, is an essay by Theodor Adorno. It's on Endgame, but it is a text that makes a lot of references to Waiting for Godot, and I think it's an important text because it also partially corrects that absurdist reading of Beckett, and it's a text written soon after Endgame was produced in 1958. So as early as 1958, Adorno makes this. Adorno is again a great philosopher in his own right, Frankfurt School philosopher. Adorno makes this very important observation, I think, that it's not an existentialist play because it's a play that laughs at existentialism, and quite literally. If you think of the moments when Didi and Gogo plan to commit suicide, each time they think about that, and this is the famous Albert Camus moment, the famous first sentence of The Myth of Sisyphus, where Camus says the most important philosophical problem is the problem of suicide. But this most important philosophical problem is laughed at in a play like Waiting for Godot, where Didi and Gogo go into practicalities. They say, well, we don't have a rope. This tree is not good enough to hold both of us. What will happen is one of us will die, the other one will be alone. And again, it's not enough for one man, as the play suggests. So it constantly laughs at and trivializes these existentialist themes. And the very fact that we do not have any high philosophical discourse in this play. It's a play about tramps, as I say, and tramps are talking like kids, as it were. In fact, the only time we have a professorial speech in the play is, to a certain extent in Pozzo, but most importantly in Lucky's monologue. And again, think about it, that particular it's a thinking dance of Pozzo, of Lucky, that he does towards the end of the first act. That whole gesture is a professorial act of thinking, which is of course laughed at, because that act of thinking is like a tirade. The play calls it a tirade. and it completely sort of castrates the master, as it were. So we also have a very clear sort of a Hegelian dynamic between the master and the slave. Hegel, the philosopher who wrote about the master-slave dialectic or the master-slave relation in Philosophy of Right, in Phenomenology of Spirit. Nevertheless, I mean, so we have a sort of a Hegelian tone in the way Beckett depicts the relationship between the master and the slave, between Lucky and Pozzo. Why do I say Hegelian? Because he shifts it. He continuously shifts it. So the famous point in Hegel is that the slave depends on the master as much as the master depends on the slave. In fact, the master is enslaved by the slave's know-how. The slave tells the master how to do certain things. If the slave doesn't do those things, the master will be left high and dry. So we have that same dependency. If you remember in the second act, when Lucky and Pozzo appear again, as I said, it's a differential repetition. So it's not an exact repetition. It's repetition with difference. So what is the difference? Now Pozzo is blind and Lucky cannot see. Sorry, Lucky cannot talk. Lucky is dumb, Pozzo is blind. This was not the case, of course, in the first act. So we have a blind man being anchored in a journey by the other man who can see but cannot talk. So in a way, Lucky is now leading the way, and Pozzo is almost entirely dominated by Lucky or dependent upon Lucky in the second act. So that's again a very interesting shift that happens. And even within the first act, we constantly see this shift, that when Lucky talks, Lucky's speech, the slave's speech, castrates the master cannot take it. There are these moments when the master is afraid of the slave, and the allegiances of Vladimir and Estragon, they also keep changing. Sometimes they are in favor of Lucky, sometimes they're in favor of Pozzo, sometimes they're in favor of the way, they're initially, they're quite critical of the way Pozzo seems to treat Lucky. So he has this huge mark, around his neck, because he's literally tied to Pozzo with a rope, and it's an abominable way of treating a human being. This is said by Vladimir and Estragon. So they're very much sympathetic towards Lucky here. And Lucky, of course, is a very ironic name. He has to be very unlucky to be in that situation. But then, as we move on, very quickly, their sympathies also shift. When Pozzo starts to complain about Lucky and how Lucky gives him a very, very, very difficult time, suddenly their mind also changes and they start, sympathizing with the master now, sympathizing with Pozzo. So their sympathies are also very shifty. Nevertheless, to come back to what I was saying, what are the larger themes apart from waiting, apart from this idea of waiting for someone who never comes? What is interesting is that the play, in a way, has this very interesting ethical lesson that if you can wait for someone or something without knowing that, whether they would come or not, and in fact, after a point, you know that the person is not going to come, and yet you wait for this person, that is an act of courage. That is an act of resilience. That's like you are at it. Nevertheless, even though you know, but you are stoic enough to understand that you have to do your work. That is, of course, where the Sisyphean angle can come in. This whole myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus knows that he can never push the rock to the top of the mountain because the rock will never stay there, but he cannot give up. He has to continue. So there is a Sisyphean theme in the act of waiting, but I would say it goes back to the original Greek myth much more than the existentialist or absurdist fashion that was quite rampant at that point in the 50s France. Nevertheless, to come back to another aspect of the play, as I said, the play is about solidarity. The play is about camaraderie, solidarity between Vladimir and Estragon. How they keep coming back to each other, how they keep finding each other. In fact, this is a point that Beckett makes in his theatrical notebooks. He works out all these different ways in which these two characters are supposed to approach each other. He calls it stages of approaching. So there's a lot of tension between these two characters, like there's a lot of tension between Lucky and Kozo as well. So they approach each other in stages, as it were, and we have, as with Pinter, again, with Beckett, this very important use of the pause. We would see this in the play, how a train of thought gets completely derailed after a pause. And, it's like I say something, and then I give a pause, and after that I say, what did I say? So my entire thought process goes for a bit of a toss after the pause. So the pause is this very important kind of a dialectical rupture in the very structure of speech. This is something that we see quite actively happening in the play. We have these very typical clownish music hall routines, like the routines of the hat, the hat being exchanged towards the end of the first act. And again, I would like to sort of draw your attention to the sort of, again, the underlying mathematical structure of such a routine. One could work out exactly how the hat is moving between these two figures, A and B, and whether it comes back, whether the circuit is complete or not. So Beckett was extremely interested in combinatorial logic, what's called factorial mathematics. This idea that if there are two things, they can only be arranged in two different ways. If there are three things, they can be arranged in more than two ways. So, and usually it's the factorial. So three things can be arranged into in 3 into 3, that is to say 9 different ways, and goes on like that. If we have 4 things, again we'll have to do 1 into 2 into 3 into 4. But for 3 things it should be 1 into 2 into 3. That's the factorial logic. So essentially 6 ways of dividing them or arranging them. With 4 things, the factorial would be 1 into 2 into 3 into 4. So this factorial mathematics of combinations, of permutations and combinations, this offers the underlying structure of something like that hat routine, the hat routine that we see in the first act of Waiting for Godot. And Beckett engages with this mathematical form in many different ways in many of his other texts. I don't have the time to go there, but I just wanted to mention. Now, in the second act, as we say, there are many differences. There are differences in Lucky and Kozo. There are differences in the tree. There is a boot which Estragon left at the end of the first act, and it is refound in Act 2. But the boot seems to have a much larger size, to the size of Estragon's feet. So one wonders whether there is actually a kind of continuity between the two acts. How much time has passed between the two acts? Is it about 2 consecutive days, or has a lot of time passed? Again, these are questions we do not have an answer. The play is primarily about these doubts and confusions. As they keep saying, are we supposed to wait here? Are we supposed to wait at this time? When is Mr. Godot supposed to come? Today or tomorrow? And as you can see, there are all these doubles. It's like a doppelganger motive, or some sort of a, let's say, an uncanny doubling motif. You have all these pairings, as I said. Another pair would be, so the pair of boots, the pair of leaves, the pair of branches, Didi and Gogo as a pair, Lucky and Kozo as a pair, the 2 acts as a pair. All these are in pairs, in doubles, right? Another double is the 2 boys. The boy who comes as the messenger of Godot at the end of the first act, and the boy who comes again as the messenger of Godot in the second act. They're not the same boys. They are brothers of each other, apparently. And the question that Vladimir and Estragon both ask very strongly, they keep asking this question to the boy, have you seen us? We have kept our word. It's like that Walter Delamere poem, The Listeners, where at the end of the poem, the traveler goes back on horseback and he says, I kept my word. Nobody responded. I came to the house, I kept my word. Similarly, as it is said in this play, they're not saints, they're not magicians, they're not historians, but how many people keep their word? They kept their word, they waited for Godot, the onus is on Godot. He did not come, or she did not come. Anyway, right, so the point here is, there's this particular motive of the Irish philosopher Bishop Berkeley, who is actually mentioned by name in Lucky's monologue, right? And Bishop Berkeley was this philosopher who famously claimed Isi ist percipiae. To be is to be perceived. So this idea that if nobody perceives me, I'm not there, comes from Bishop Berkeley. And we have this sort of Berkeleyan motive in those two approaches by the two tramps to the two boys in Act 1 and 2. When they charge the boy and they say, tell me you've seen me. Tomorrow you won't come back and tell me you've never seen me. So that's the Berkeleyan motive, as it were. Your perception of me will give me existence. If you do not perceive me, I don't exist. So that Berkeleyan motive is there. A quick word, as I promised, on the lucky speech. We're coming towards the end. I'll wind up in the next 5 minutes. A quick word on the lucky speech. It's a very difficult speech at first. It's unpunctuated. The important themes in that speech are as follows. Number one, this idea of a God, but an indifferent God, a God who does not act. Almost a scientific invention, God as a kind of scientific invention, as it were, made in the works of, as he says, Puncher, Watchman. There are many neologisms. It's a very Joycean monologue. There are many neologisms there. There are lots of very, witty puns there, like fart of and belcher. Fart off, belch comes from belching. So there are many such puns. Cunard is mentioned, Nancy Cunard, who was one of Beckett's sort of early godmothers in France. And she was, in fact, the person who helped Beckett publish his first book of poems in Paris, a book called Horoscope. The title poem was Horoscope, which was a competition poem, and he had won the first prize. Anyway, he also did a lot of translations of, radical African writings, Afro-American writings, Francophone African writings in a collection called Negroes. At that point, this word wasn't a banned word. Nevertheless, so he did this for Nancy Cunard. Nancy Cunard is also mentioned in this speech. Then we have some historical references to places in Ireland, like Connemara, Stocking Feet in Connemara. What is mentioned, the skull in Connemara is mentioned at the end. So there are these references to historical catastrophes, historical disasters that happened in the Irish history. There's also a reference, as I say, to this indifferent God. Similarly, there's this theme of decay, physical decay. In spite of all the sports that human beings play, how their body decays with time. There's almost an elegiac acknowledgement of physical deterioration of human life. And then there's a sort of a dark ecology, as it were, a dark ecology where we are talking about extinction of the species, and that's where this expression comes in the latter half of the speech, abode of stones, where the entire world becomes an abode of stones. In spite of the tennis, in spite of the hockey, in spite of all these sports, human body degenerates, and what we have finally is an extinction of the species and a realm of stones, as it were, the generation of nuclear winter or something like that. And we have that sort of very strong environmental consciousness in this monologue. So, and the fact that this is thinking as terror is also something that I wanted to sort of very briefly highlight, because this is again an idea that Beckett partially borrows from Descartes, this idea of thought as a kind of torture. At one point, we have the sentence in the play, the most horrible thing is to have thought. To have thought, not to think, but to have thought, because there are compulsive thoughts we have. We have compulsive thoughts as well, thoughts that happen to us without we wanting to think along those lines, right? Without us wanting to think along those lines. So, nevertheless, this idea of what he calls mental murder, in fact, in a theatrical notebook, or this idea of the horror of having thought, not to think, but to have thought. And there are these references to there are references to the charnel houses in the second half, all the dead voices that weep like the willow tree. The tree is willow, by the way, the tree that is there on the stage. So there are these oblique references to the dead, primarily in the context of the war. Another important sort of micro action that we have in the second act is this moment when the blind and the dumb, they fall, they have a fall, and they can't get up from the ground. It seems like Lucky has passed out, and Pozzo is crying for help. And at that point, Vladimir and Estragon take some time to sort of decide whether, whether they should go and help them. And there's this very important moment, an ethical moment, which again mirrors the war situation. And we have this, speech by Vladimir, a very famous speech where it starts with something like, have I slept while others suffered? And they contemplate for a while whether they should go and help the two. And then they decide to help them. And it's very interesting, the kind of Sartrean reasoning we have in that passage. So initially, Vladimir asks himself whether this cry for help was addressed to him or addressed to him and Estragon. And then he thinks, well, it doesn't matter. It was addressed to all humanity. But at that point, at this particular moment, all humanity is us. So we have to respond to the cry for help, the call for help, and we have to do something. Let us not spend time in idle discourse while we have something to do. That's another speech of Vladimir's in the second act. So this micro action where they fall and Vladimir and Estragon go to pick them up, this is again showing us an ethics of action. So when I say passivity or pacifism, it does not mean there is no action. There is action, but there is a critique of that activistic model of the war, where war in a certain jingoist discourse is considered pure action, aggressive, masculinist action. And the play resists that kind of masculinity and that kind of action as well. The way the play shows masculinity in crisis is again a very interesting but a discussion that we cannot go into right now. We also have this discord, I'm finishing now, we also have this discord between what is said and what happens. So famously at the end of both acts we have let's go and then they don't move. So there is a certain discord between what is said, let's go, and what actually happens, they don't move, right? Because they can't go anywhere, they're transfixed as it were to the spot. They have to keep coming back every day and wait for Godot in the same spot. Maybe every single day such a boy will come and will tell them that Godot will not come today, but maybe it might be coming tomorrow. There's no way they can hang themselves from the tree because of the practical reasons we have already mentioned. So this has to go on forever, as it were. Right? So there's a lot more to be said about the play, of course, but I don't think we have the time for that. So let me stop here.